Hey friends, there's an old saying, show me your friends, I'll show you your future. Well, my friends include Carey Nieuwhof, and that means my 30-minute podcast has turned into his length podcast. It's over an hour long, but it's so good. So rather than try and hit you with a curveball and make you listen for an hour, we've split this into 2 parts. We think you're really going to like it. Listen in and tune in next week for the exciting finish. Thanks for listening. Well, hey, everybody. Welcome to the Vanderbloemen Leadership Podcast. Let's try that again. The Vanderbloemen Leadership Podcast. See, I can't even say it, so don't worry if you can't say it. But if you need to tell a friend about it, just type Vanderbloemen however you want into Google. My last name is so messed up, I can't say it, and it'll feed you right to our site if you just try typing it. We're glad you're here today. It's good to be back after summer break. If you want to hear more about that, we have an episode about why I do that, how you can start to do that. It's really an effort to build sustainability for our company and for my life. And I think if you're a leader, it's worth listening. I think that's what makes me excited about today, because today I've got the burnout expert of all experts with us, Carey Nieuwhof, who is kind of the Jimmy Fallon of the church world. It's pretty amazing how many people you've gotten to interview. Thanks for taking time out of a busy schedule to visit with us today, Carey.
Always. It's just nice to be on a podcast with someone else who has an impossible last name. So thank you, William.
Well, if you ain't Dutch, you ain't much, right?
Exactly. Just ask any Dutch person.
Oh, that's funny. Well, I would bet nearly every listener knows who you are, but it might be worth giving just a quick, here's Carey and how you ended up doing what you're doing.
Yeah, sure. So when I was a little kid, I wanted to go into law. I went to law school, met the wife of my dreams, was in law for a year, felt a call into ministry, went to seminary, and for the last almost 30 years have been about an hour north of Toronto, working with an amazing group of people. We eventually started with mainline church, eventually became non-denominational, and that church went on to become Connexus Church. I led it for 20 years, and about 10 years ago, stepped out of the lead role, 9 years ago, I guess, stepped out of the lead role. And for the last decade or so, have been really focused on helping church leaders. So I do a leadership podcast. I've written some books. I speak around the world. I host something called the Art of Leadership Academy. And, the way I think about it, William, I went to law school, but nobody taught me how to run a law firm. And I went to seminary and nobody taught me how to run a seminary. So I try to fill in the gaps on all those things nobody teaches you along the way. There's a lot of unhappy lawyers, and I'm not so much in the business world these days, but a lot of, church leaders who are well-intentioned, really struggling. How can I get in their corner and help them out with, world level conversations with Jim Collins, Seth Godin, Craig Rochelle, Priscilla Shire, whoever, we try to get them in the house. And then also produce some really practical resources on everything from navigating church conflict to how to teach without using notes, like all those things you're not going to get at even a good seminary. So that's what I do these days.
Such a similar path. I didn't realize that's what I was doing, but when we started, it's like, I went to Princeton for seminary, which is a pretty good degree. And
absolutely.
I didn't have one bit of instruction about how to run a staff meeting.
No.
Or how to fire somebody.
Or hire somebody or fire somebody or personnel. Or what about your one-on-one meetings, William? It's like, no clue.
Yeah.
Had to figure it all out, right? It's job security for people like you and me.
Yeah, and fill the gap between what you learned in school and what you actually need to know.
Well, and that was the hard part. Like even doctors really struggle with that. It's like, how do you run, unless you're on staff at a hospital, how do you run a family practice? Lawyers, how do you run a law firm? Like it's really difficult. The sign's changing all the time because they don't know how to get along. It used to be Vanderbloemen and Nieuwhof, and now it's Vanderbloemen and Vanderbloemen, and then it was Nieuwhof and Nieuwhof, and now it's something else. That's the thing with law firms, is because people don't know how to do it, and you have that same challenge of turnover and I knew the theory of how to preach, and I had a great preacher, but he said, never use the word you and never tell personal stories. Well, like personal stories are one of the best way to connect with people. And we were told to read from manuscripts, not to speak without using notes and things like that. So, I had to unlearn a lot of that. And that was a great prof. I had to unlearn a lot of it to learn how to actually connect with people. And so, it's a supplement, not a replacement for seminary.
Yeah, Princeton, it kind of prides itself on a lot of things, but the preaching curriculum is off the charts. And really, really good. But you walk away with they call it the Princeton lilt. It's like you're a little too snotty, a little too learned. As C.S. Lewis said, he was guilty of intellectual snobbery. That's kind of what happens. And I remember, I don't think I've told you this story, but real briefly, I came out of seminary and went into an associate pastorate where I got to preach about, I don't know, 6 or 8 times a year, something like that. So I was always looking for ways to go find more preaching reps. I would do funerals for people that didn't have anybody to do the funeral for. I mean, like, I found out that the homeless mission in town, my little town in North Carolina, would allow me to come preach, and I could preach on Tuesday. I'm like, great. Which Tuesday? Like, all of them. So you have to go to chapel to get to go to lunch. So it's kind of a forced devotional. And I was there and I was preaching with my Princeton lilt and all my good learning and quoting some great theologian or something or another. And I did not have the room. It was so bad. It was awful.
Oh.
And then my friend, now a friend, no, and then Harry, who's schizophrenic, and a significant percentage of the homeless population is mentally ill in the United States.
Of course. Yeah.
And Harry just stood up next to me and started preaching his own sermon while I was preaching. And eventually he started getting amens and I got nothing. So I got benched. And that's what
Get Harry to do it. I mean, this is not the purpose of being on your show. We've known each other for a long time. I don't think I ever told you. I was the weekend that Tiger Woods turned pro. I was in Princeton, New Jersey, lining up to do my PhD in homiletics at Princeton. Had a scholarship all lined up, and then the chair of the department resigned. And I'm like, okay, I don't want to study under other people. I want to study under that guy. And so I stayed here.
Tom
Still
Long
here all these years later.
Tom Long is
It was Tom
really
Long.
great preaching.
It was Tom Long. Yeah, Tom and
I had
met.
Tom
Yeah.
preaching class, and he's got a gift. So
he taught me how to preach without using notes. I drove him back to the airport once from Toronto, and he said, it was him who gave me the advice, don't memorize your talk, understand it. And that changed how I communicated. Anyway, he wasn't there anymore. And then I'm like, well, I'll just stay here and be a pastor. So
yeah, well, it was great. And you learn
non-Princeton stumble or whatever you call that. If you don't have the lilt, you have the stumble. I guess I got the stumble because I didn't go.
Well, so many commonalities. My later preaching professor was Tim Keller, who I know you befriended in the later part of his life. Yeah, he taught me with Ed Clowney. It was pretty special.
That podcast is like on some bootleg. I always find it once in a while, and it's so good. It's really hard to find, but if you can get Clowney and Keller together, it's killer what they teach.
I've never wept during a lecture, except then. Just so good. Anyway, things that people need to know that maybe they don't need to know about us. I was thinking of several little topics. I mean, you don't have a book coming out. We're not here to push some new thing that you've got. This is really, how can we tap into what you're learning? And because the number one question I get is, what are you seeing out there? Because pastors, heads of school, heads of nonprofits, they get burrowed down in whatever thing they're focused on, and they don't know what's going on. And I thought, here, my good friend Carey, he's out and about, he hears, he sees. And I thought, if we could just talk about a few trends, I would love to hear what you're hearing to try and help our listeners. And I'm going to go ahead and just roll a grenade to start. You chose to do a podcast series on the presidential election in the United States.
I did.
Are you on medication?
Yes, and it's not going well. I'm off my meds, I guess, or something. You know what? It was really interesting because I was talking to friends about it, and I have an interest in America. Most of my audience is American, even though I'm Canadian. I have a degree in American politics and history. My wife's an American, so there's a lot of ties to the country, and still, I mean, as go America, so goes the world, right? Like, you look at that. And honestly, my approach as a pastor is to stick my head in the sand and hope it all disappears, and we'll just, come up for air in December or January or whatever, February, and it'll all be back to normal. And I thought that's kind of a coward's way out. So I had a problem in that I don't know how to really tackle that well, and I don't like what I'm seeing. And I think most people don't like what they're seeing because you hear from two extremes. And most of us aren't on one of those extremes. So I thought, well, I'm going to do some research. So I reached out to some of the brightest thinkers I know who could maybe talk some sense into us. And it's not really, Harris versus Trump. That's not the purpose of the podcast series that we aired or are airing, depending on when this airs. But it was really to get at the issue under the issue. Like, we're in a cultural and ideological divide right now, and our culture has become more polarized, more tribalized. Hate has been monetized. And I really wanted to get on the issues under the issues. And then I wanted to talk to people like everyone from Ed Stetzer to N.T. Wright to Mark Sayers on, well, if you're going to speak politically, what do you say? Like, do you just pick a side? And nobody, conservative or liberal is like, yeah, as a faithful preacher of the gospel, you should pick a side. But what I'm really happy about with the series is it kind of got to the issues under the issues. Why is everybody so inflamed? Why is everybody so upset? And what you learn is that 95% of the problems in the church have nothing to do with the church. That, yeah, you might get a super angry email, William, about, if you were preaching, why you picked a side, why you didn't pick a side, why you should have picked a side, why you picked the wrong side, why you said something too loudly, too softly, it doesn't matter what you do. And when I talk to pastors, and we have the privilege of talking to hundreds, if not, more pastors all the time, and you're in trouble no matter what you do today. If you're quiet, you're in trouble for being quiet. If you're loud, you're in trouble for being loud. If you said something, you didn't say it quite the right way. And anybody in day-to-day ministry right now can identify with that. And so what's going on there? Well, I had the privilege on my podcast earlier this year to interview William Ury. And I was introduced to his stuff at law school. He is the textbook on negotiation. If you're going to study negotiation, you study William Ury. And he's still like helping the US government figure out Middle East peace and de-escalating conflict with North Korea. If you remember 2017 with Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump and all that, he's involved in that stuff. And I tested that theory by him. I said, do you really think like the presenting issue is the presenting issue? He goes, it never is. Very rarely is it the presenting issue. And so the hope for pastors in the midst of this is dig a little deeper and you discover that the guy who wrote you in all caps is going through a really difficult time at home. I mean, maybe there's some financial problems. Maybe his marriage is at the brink of dissolution. Maybe his kids don't talk to him right now, or he's going to lose his job. But there's often pain under the issue. And he's definitely mad about politics, but politics is not the real issue. And the good news for pastors is if you come alongside empathetically with people, you can just say, well, what else is going on in your life? Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. Wow. Okay. And you kind of pastor them and the presenting issue kind of de-escalates. Maybe it doesn't entirely go away, but it deflates. And so there was that. There was also, if you're going to preach, what do you preach about? I would suggest you preach about the issues under the issue. Identity. We've been uprooted as a culture in terms of our identity as fewer and fewer people profess any kind of faith, let alone faith in Christ. Your identity created by God is seeking to attach to something. So it's success, or it's money, or it's politics, or it's ideology. I am what I believe. And so, okay, well, do a series on identity then and talk about our real identity isn't red or blue. It's not independent. It's not who's in the White House or the governor's seat. It's actually in Christ. And what does it mean to be rooted in Christ? So we got into stuff like that. And I thought, it's not like, here are 3 steps to have total peace in your, it's not that, but I think it's an exploration over multiple hours of the issues under the issues. And so that's why I went there, and it helped me understand it a lot better too.
I was listening on a morning run. I guess while we're filming this, you had just aired your first episode, and Andy Stanley was your guest. Yeah. Very well done. It sort of hit on that. It dawned on me, you've been a pastor a long time. I was a pastor before I do what I do. How many times, if you're listening today and you're a pastor, how many times has the couple come in that's fighting about something he did or something she said, and it is not about either one of those things?
Right. Exactly. It's true. The presenting issue is rarely the issue. And it happens in your home too, right? Like who left the ketchup out on the counter? That's not about the ketchup being left out on the counter. Or, that's about something else. You've got other issues going on in your family. And the same is true in the church. And, it was actually Andy who taught me that. I've known him for 20 years. He's like, empathize with your opponents. Just call them up. And I had somebody who was really mad at me because I had publicly profiled someone that he doesn't like. And he sent a thoughtful, measured email through the public account. My assistant forwarded it to me, and his number was there. So I just gave him a call, and we had a very measured conversation about it. I learned more about him, his church, his family. And, I don't know that I changed his mind, but we're not enemies. So.
Well, I wanted to test a theory I was thinking about, and you've just done this series, so you'd know, but I'm beginning to think, the issue beneath the issue is that's like the thing beneath the thing, right? That Steve Carter has out there. It's where everything is. But I get a little tone deaf to what's really going on because I think I'm living in a world now where the news that is fed to me happens to reinforce what I already believe.
Correct. The algorithm knows what you click on.
And it will just try and inflame that. Where I think what I'm having to learn to do is read people I don't want to read. Read both of the newspapers that are extreme on both sides. Find a way to listen more to what I would call it the other side, what have you. And I was listening to David French talk, if you know David, and he said he asked a person of one of the two parties, what do you believe? Well, I believe this, this, and this. And do you believe that your party is tolerant? Well, absolutely, we're tolerant. We tolerate everyone of every race and creed and kind and socioeconomic, the whole thing. And he said, okay, so your opposing party, what are they like? Well, they're awful. And he said, so what are you tolerating? If it's only things you agree with, you're not tolerating anything. Tolerating is to bear a load. And so I'm having to challenge myself, like, how do I go bear a load without compromising that? I don't know if that tapped into anything you've heard in your conversations, but am I off base
Totally
there?
did. Another thing is we're out of practice in relationship. The good news about social media is you can learn anything, anytime about anyone that you want to. The bad news is in real life, you look at any data point. I mean, the US Surgeon General has declared loneliness and isolation epidemics in the United States. And you look at Gen Z, I mean, you see increasing anxiety around even phone calls and human relationships and conflict. And, Jonathan Haidt's making important contributions in that field right now, trying to get us to have a little more adversity and a little higher tolerance for some of the challenges that we have. And so, that's definitely an issue. And the good news is for church leaders who are listening, or if you're a lay leader invested in your church, nobody should be able to out community the local church, right? Like we should be the people who are like, no, we're having face-to-face conversations. We're going to meet in each other's homes during the week. We're going to meet at this building on the weekend. We're going to sit next to someone who isn't the same socioeconomic status that we are, doesn't live in the same neighborhood, isn't the same income level, maybe votes a little bit differently. And we're going to be in community because we're united by something that transcends all of this. So I think, the good news for churches is, right now we're kind of the problem. We're feeding the problem. But if we get off the script that the culture is feeding us, we're also the solution, because the gospel has within it the actual solution to a lot of the problems that we're facing.
Oh, right down to I think we've talked about this before on a podcast, but I'm struck that, so I learned from a number of people, look for the first place something is mentioned in Scripture, that the principle of the firsts. And so anytime you see something, when's the first time that happened? You go back to it. So what is the first thing God cursed?
It was was it Eve got the first curse or Adam? You're testing my Genesis 3 knowledge.
Okay,
I'm going to say it was work, but I don't think that's
so
true.
it's
the serpent.
It's not in Genesis 3.
It's not.
God said, "Let there be light."
I should have gone to Princeton. It's pretty clear.
Yeah, that's right. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light, and it was good. Benediction. And then he made whatever he made next. I don't know the order, plants or animals or stars.
Yeah.
Actually, the second thing he did was he started a calendar and the sun and the moon. So he had a plan, but that was good. And then the next thing's good. Blessing, blessing, blessing. And they man, it was very good, right? And then God turns around and says, it's not good, curse, that man be left alone.
Mm-hmm. Fair
Now,
enough.
think about that for a second. He cursed us being in solitude or alone or antisocial even. He cursed that before sin entered the world. Isn't that powerful?
That is powerful.
And I just think, I noticed it years ago when we were all locked in our houses for the pandemic, but like the isolation that's happening through whether it's social media or just the way we're wired, that's the ultimate plan of the enemy, is to divide and isolate.
And I'm a big fan of online church. I mean, I think it's great, but it's a it's a supplement, not a replacement for in-person community. And I think the church could lead the way there. We could still, we're the one organization, because all the social clubs have basically dissolved. I mean, you go to a Kiwanis or a Rotary and it's all a bunch of 75-year-old men who aren't going to be here in 15 years. And, there's very few organizations that really draw an entire community together, but that is the church on mission. So I think
that's the Howard Schultz fabulous podcast we were talking about before we aired, called Acquired. If you have 3.5 hours, I do a little bit of long distance running, so it's a couple runs and that'll do me. He was talking about, the one thing that makes him so mad about his company right now is the way the app has taken over ordering, because he wanted Starbucks to be the third space, the gathering. Not work, not home, but the third, and it's destroyed it. Like 40% of their orders are walk in, walk out, and he can't stand it. So it's prevalent everywhere we're turning. And I'm trying to ask myself, how do I get more in community and around people I don't agree with? And I don't know, maybe I'm just wishy-washy, not wanting to take a side.
I remember one of the first times I was in Europe, I was speaking to church leaders, and it dawned on me that still in Europe 10 years ago, the idea of a takeout coffee was foreign, because it's not a drink, it's a conversation. You go, you sit down, you linger, you bring a friend, you bring your spouse, and you sit down and you have a cup of coffee together. Why would you ever want to bring that in your car? Nobody can get it. And European cars for years had fewer cup holders than American cars. I remember I had a Toyota Sienna minivan, man. It had like 17 cup holders and space for 7 passengers.
That's right.
Eight, something like that. And like 17 cup holders. It was like, how much are we drinking? What is going on here?
Yeah, no cup holders, and the air conditioning stinks on all the cars from Europe because it's never warm there. In Houston, we need air conditioning. So different podcast. I will say, on this whole loneliness thing, I was reminded when I was listening to one of your podcasts that George MacDonald, not Gordon, who was a bit of a mentor to C.S. Lewis. He wrote, the line goes, I think it is, hell is God's granting of our final wish to be left alone. And I thought, that's what I got to learn from that. So enough on politics, though. I would encourage anybody listening to go find that podcast series. We're going to air this before the election, so you can catch it midstream.
It'll be wrapping up in mid-September, I think. Early September. It's 6 interviews, and then I do a solo episode.
Well, we'll make sure to put it in the show notes. Tuning in, and as I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, we've got a whole nother installment of this episode. I don't think you're going to want to miss it. Carey gets pretty honest with us about what he's seeing out there, and that guy's got a viewpoint that very few people can say they have. So tune in next week for the second installment of my conversation with my friend Carey.